Vice President of the United States is in Poland, tasked with smoothing America's relationship with its key ally after a recent turbulent section over fighter jets. After her arrival in Warsaw, the American Vice President held a meeting with both the Prime Minister and President of Poland. The leaders discussed how to provide military assistance for Ukraine and further military coordination among allies.
Sorry, don't push me.
The trip was planned days before the recent rift over fighter jets between Poland and the United States. Warsaw took Washington by surprise by offering to send jets to Ukraine via an American airbase, although Washington has rejected that proposal. The Pentagon has now deployed 2 air defence units to Poland, though, to bolster its system of defence. America's 2 Patriot surface-to-air missile batteries have been repositioned from Germany to Poland as Washington tries to secure the NATO alliance territory against any potential threat. The Pentagon refrained from specifying their operational status, but did confirm that the missiles were manned. Nuclear tensions remain, however, as some worry that the Russian president may escalate the war further after Vladimir Putin put his nuclear forces on heightened alert a few days ago. US officials, though, have not yet detected any threatening changes in Russia's nuclear posture.
The whole backdrop to this relationship with Ukraine at the moment in terms of assisting them is that keeping in mind ways to avoid having the war spill over into any of the neighboring countries, some of which are NATO countries. And if that were to happen, of course, then you would have a war of NATO against Russia. And the implication there is that it could potentially escalate to a nuclear war. Nobody wants that.
Well, our correspondent Rosie Burchard is joining us live from Brussels now. Rosie, this meeting obviously comes after a very public dismissal by the United States of Poland's offer for fighter jets to be passed to them. So is it all about rebuilding relations?
Well, Laura, we can't say for sure whether these 2 events are linked, but what we can say is that it's certainly something that will be music to the ears of Poland. This is something Warsaw has been calling for. Poland, of course, shares a long border with Ukraine, and it's one of several NATO allies that asked for what's called Article 4 consultations in recent weeks, and that essentially means it feels threatened. Poland sharing that border with Ukraine and, of course, feeling very exposed at this time. The core of this really is that Poland is part of NATO defensive alliance, and that means it can expect defensive support from other NATO allies like the United States. There are thousands of US troops in Poland, both bilaterally and through NATO. So this is something, as I said, Poland has been calling for. Now, of course, Ukraine, on the other hand, is not a member of NATO, and that's so much the core of this conflict. Ukraine has been very forthright in its criticism of NATO countries, saying they have not been doing enough. Of course, Ukraine had asked for this no-fly zone. That was a no-go for NATO, and it's for similar reasons that we saw this fighter jet deal simply being dismissed by the United States, and it's because there are fears that if NATO was seen to be really sending any troops or aircraft directly into the Ukrainian territory, that could be seen as an escalation and lead to what NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg said would be a fully fledged war with even greater consequences for human suffering.
And Rosie, EU heads of state are also going to meet later to discuss the crisis in Ukraine. The bloc has already imposed heavy sanctions on Russia, but can we expect more action?
Laura, there are these 2 big institutions here in Brussels, NATO and the European Union. They share more than 20 members, and those EU heads of state are headed to Versailles in France for some serious talks amid what is, of course, a very escalating crisis and very tense times here in Europe. We understand that those heads of state will be discussing Europe's energy dependence on Russia. Until very recently, at least, around 40% of EU gas imports came from Russia. That's of high concern, and they are trying to really cut that dependency by at least 2/3 by the end of this year. We recently had a new announcement of fresh sanctions from the European Union. Now the number of individuals under asset freezes and travel bans is 862 for those linked to this particular conflict. But they'll likely be having discussions about what further sanctions could come next and what could trigger them. Those will all be behind closed doors, and simply because they raise some very uncomfortable questions, namely just how bad is this going to get, and what could be the trigger for an even bigger package of sanctions toward Moscow. And this all comes, of course, as suffering in Ukraine continues and Ukrainians face another day of conflict.
Rosie Burchard in Brussels, thank you.